Hey guys, and welcome to the second video in my Learn PuzzleScript series. This one's going to focus on beginning to learn programming in PuzzleScript. If you haven't done the first video, then I strongly suggest that you do now. There's a link in the description below. The first video focuses more on learning how to do the basic interface and talks a little bit about game design and some good best practices to get started and how you might experiment designing your own puzzles. Whereas now we're going to start talking about programming. You can go to my blog, which is stuartpixelgames.com, and go to tutorials, PuzzleScript, and then go to start programming in PuzzleScript. And this YouTube video goes alongside the written version of the tutorial, and the written version can make it a lot easier if you just want to copy and paste things from the website into your code. So once you've done that, go back to puzzlescript.net, there's a link to that in the description below as well, and click on Make a Game. It's worth mentioning at this point that you need no prior programming knowledge whatsoever. Unfortunately, learning PuzzleScript isn't going to necessarily be transferable to learning other programming languages. However, the logical way of thinking is a skill and will be useful for other programming languages, so it's not a bad place to start. It's a really cool way to start getting into making games and just having fun, which is really important that you always have fun when you do creative things, I believe. And it's a really good way to learn game design. And the cool thing is, once you know how to program, you can then just focus on doing game design. Like any idea that you have, you can go and make it. You don't have to get someone to do it for you. So I think learning programming is probably the most valuable skill you can get in this tech age that we're coming into. So good job on learning that skill. Now, to begin with, create a new game, and then you want to go load example and load basic. Or if you're following on from the previous tutorial, just load the save project that you have from the last tutorial. Now, just a quick overview. On the left hand side of the screen is all of the code that we need. We won't worry too much about what objects and legends and sounds are. We're just going to come right down to the section called rules, and that's mainly what we're going to focus on today. Rules is essentially the core of our code. That is where we tell PuzzleScript what to do in certain situations. The very first line of code here, this rule, tells us a lot about why, when we play the game, if you run it, when we try and push the crate, what it gets pushed. So breaking down what this rule means is essentially, it means on the left we have our condition, and then on the right we have an event. So basically we're going to see if the condition on the left is true, we do this event. And this red arrow in the middle is what separates them. So on the left is the condition, and on the right of the red arrow is what we want to do if that condition is true. Now, what do I mean by a condition? In this case, the condition is if the player is next to a crate and moving towards it, then push the player in the crate. So that's our condition. Now, understanding a little bit more what this means. So we can see our condition is separated by these square brackets, and then the line in the middle tells us that the player and the crate are next to each other. If we took the line away, we'd be saying if a player was on top of a crate, right? But by putting the line in the middle, we're saying if a player is next to a crate. Likewise, if we put this, it would mean if the player was next to a crate and that crate was next to another crate, then do something. So if a player is next to a crate, so this, you can just read this line as next to, and then this arrow means if the player is next to the crate, and then the arrow means moving towards. So if the player is moving towards the crate that it's next to, then what we want to do is keep the player next to the crate, and then this arrow means move the player towards the crate, but the crate, in this sense, the same arrow actually means move away from the player. You can see it visually. Like if we change the direction of the arrow on the player, this would actually say if the player was moving away from the crate, then move the crate away from the player. But in this case, because both arrows are facing the same direction, the crate and the player will actually end up moving in the same direction. So just to help you understand that a little bit better, if we change the direction of these arrows, this is now saying if the player is moving away from the crate. So if the player is next to a crate and moving away from them, then what we want to do is move the player away from the crate and also move the crate in the same direction. So you will pull the crate. So if we, now that we've changed the rule, we have to press run again. Oh, sorry, it's because this isn't real code. I have to delete that. So if we press run again, and now if we move it away from the crate, he pulls the crate, but we can't push it anymore. If you wanted to do both, just copy paste that code and change the arrows. Then that would make it that you could either push or pull a crate. So we can push it and we can pull it. But it only works when we're right next to the crate. Because see here, we're not next to it moving away from it, but we're not pushing or pulling it. And walking next to it does nothing either. Now, to look at it another way, we can check to see if we're on top of another object, like I said. Now, because we got this section called collision layers, it's like, I don't know if you use Photoshop, but you can have objects on different layers to sort of determine what's above or below another object. So the top layer with background is everything on the bottom. And then targets sit on top of the background, and then players, walls, and crates sit above that. That's why when you look at the game window and we got our player, you can see he's on top of the grass, and the player can also walk on top of the target, but he can't walk on top of walls. By default, everything that's on the same layer is considered solid. So you don't have to program that you can't walk through walls. You just can't because they're on the same collision layer. Same with the crate. But you can also program and interact with things on different layers. So for one thing, we could push the target if we wanted, if we just change our code like that and run it. So now if the player is next to a target and moves towards it, then the player and the target will both move. So it doesn't matter that they're on layers. We can still push them around. Now, if we try something different, if we say if the player is on top of the target, we'll get rid of all the movement. Then destroy the target. If we just get rid of the target completely from the code, it means it's going to disappear. So now it's like we're eating targets. Likewise, if the player is moving towards a target on the next event, we can just delete the target. If we put a couple more targets in there, and then we'll just update our level. Now we can eat them as well. So just to recap, this line means if one object is next to another object, and if you put more than one line it'll check if that object is next to that object, and then that is also next to that, right? And these arrows determine which direction that you're moving. The red line in the middle differentiates between the condition and then what happens if that condition is true. That's the basics of coding in PuzzleScript. Now, something you have to keep in mind when you're coding in PuzzleScript is that you have to keep things even. Now, what I mean by that is, because on the left side of our condition, we're checking if one object is next to another object, you know, when we delete our target on the other side, we can't just remove the line, because if we try and run that, it gives us an error, because it's saying here we're checking if two objects are next to each other. Here we're looking at a different kind of condition to see if something else is in the same square. So it's like saying if the player is next to a target, now it's next to nothing, right? Whereas this is saying, when we get rid of that next to, it's saying if the player is next to a target, it's now not standing on top of anything, which is weird, and it doesn't make sense. PuzzleScript doesn't understand it. So you have to, whatever you describe on the left, you have to re-describe it on the right and how it's going to change. The other thing to notice is that it's really good to pay attention to the errors. So you can see here when we got rid of our next to and it wasn't equal anymore, over here it says in a rule, each pattern to match on the left has to have a corresponding pattern on the right of equal length, number of cells. By number of cells, it means separating it with the next two things. So it's counting, this is one cell, if the player is next to a target, and then target is another cell. And then if we had another object we're checking if it's next to, then it's calling another cell. It's sort of a weird way of saying whatever situation you describe on the left, describe it on the right as well, the same way, right? That makes sense. But it is good to pay attention to these errors because generally PuzzleScript has very useful errors that will help you to know what to look for. And the other thing as well is it tells you specifically which line in the code it thinks is the problem. So here it's saying line 81. Pretty sure if we click that, it will actually take us to the line in our code. So if you're somewhere else and you get an error, just click it and then have a look. Okay, line, all these down here on the left side of the screen, you can see all these numbers. That's to tell you which line of code it is. And then here, this is our line of code that it's talking about. I'm going to suggest to you, if you want to get more comfortable with programming in PuzzleScript, that you start by trying to make some rules of your own and experimenting. So I've given you, I think, some pretty good basic pointers to start with. Now I'm just making another little example while I'm talking of one way that you could experiment. So if we save that and make this our new level, we have to make sure there's a target in there as well, of course. Put our target in there. So if we put our new level in, now there's something else we can do. We can go, if player is next to a crate, move the crate, but actually we're going to put another cell in there. So we're going to put another next to, and here we're going to put ... So when you do the ... instead of saying if a player is next to a crate, it's saying if a player is on the same line as a crate, so like the player is right now, they're on the same line in a sort of cross shape together, and moves and then moves towards the crate on that line. So if I move up now, you can see it pushes the crate. Now if we copy and pasted this and did before, I do like a push and pull. Just reload that. So you don't actually have to be next to the crate in this situation. You just have to be in line with it, which could lead to some really interesting puzzles. So try and experiment with some different ideas, you know, like I said, like try and eat crates or something and make different objects. If you go to the docs and go to Rules 101, it's not a bad place. The documentation is pretty good. It's not a bad place to get some ideas, and it gives you some suggestions of different types of rules that you can experiment with for yourself, which is just where I got a lot of my ideas from initially. And so you've got things like talking about late, how you can do things like this, where you can sort of teleport from one object to another, locking movement just on the horizontal or vertical plane, and lots of other things. So if you just feel like experimenting, having a bit of a look at the documentation, and I've got a bunch of other tutorials, like I said earlier, on my blog, which you can go and have a look with while you're waiting, which are interesting, teach you how to create your own objects, set win conditions, add music and sound effects. I will be making a new tutorial soon. I'll be looking at making a new YouTube tutorial to go along with the creating objects tutorial. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and if you like this tutorial and you want to see more like it, press the subscribe button below, and I'll see you next time.